Grandpa Mapped Out His Entire Basement by Harrison Prince. After Grandma died, Grandpa became pretty reclusive. My parents would force us to drive over once or twice a month for a Sunday family dinner, just to keep him company, but it was pretty obvious that he had changed. He was no longer a jovial old man who would crack jokes from his childhood. He wouldn't pore over my stories with me and point out ways I could make it better. He was a journalist back in the day. He would stare blankly at my little brother Jake's attempts to amaze him with cartwheels and backflips learned from a gymnastics class. He lost all of his light for a few years. About 3 years after Grandma had died, Dad's brother, my Uncle Bruce, died in a car accident. He was single when he died, no spouse or kids. The accident sent Dad into a spiraling depression, and I suspect it tipped Grandpa's behavior yet again. Grandpa transitioned from empty and depressed to an obsessive hoarder. His house began to fill with stacks and stacks of boxes and books. Trash was everywhere. The walls were covered in papers and string like in the movies. Dad tried hard to have many heart-to-hearts with Grandpa, but always came home frustrated. He didn't tell us kids what was going on, but we could all see the toll it was taking on Dad. For 5 years, Grandpa went on like that. We stopped visiting within a year of Uncle Bruce's death. That may have been selfish on my dad's part, but I had no capability to judge that. And then, on a day out of the blue when I was at college, I got the call. Grandpa had passed away in his house. A kind neighbor usually went to check up on him, putting up with his ravings for an hour every month. She was a kind woman, also an older widow. The neighbor found him dead in the house, the police were called, and his body collected. Dad was the one who called me. He broke the news in a relieved tone. I comforted him because he started sobbing on the phone, weighed down by the guilt because of how relieved he was. I flew home that day to help with the funeral preparations. I did as much homework as I could on the flight, knowing it might be a while before I could go back. I knew how sensitive Dad was to death now. I knew I'd have to step up and be a good son. At home, the mood was somber. Jake had driven home from the college an hour away where he was. No one was really sure what to do. Mom had to take the lead on the funeral arrangements. Dad had no other family to rely on. Mom really stepped up. One of my jobs was to hunt down photos for the funeral, pictures to add to scrapbooks and put up at the actual service. Dad had a few from when Grandpa was older, but he wanted some from when Dad and Uncle Bruce had been kids. So, it was my job to go into Grandpa's hoarder house and locate the desired pictures. It was an unsavory task from the moment I heard it, but I stepped up. For Dad. The door could barely open. Not because of the stacks of stuff, but because the hinges had rusted. The air was humid with a moldy smell. I recoiled before grabbing my nose, taking shallow breaths, and pressing on. I tried turning on the light, but even the light fixtures were too dim for the house. It did nothing to add light to the room. The people who had taken his body out had cleared the way for their stretcher to get through. There were wheel tracks in the carpet, picking up grime and creating straight lines to the door. Entire stacks of books and boxes and papers had been toppled. I reacted at their impolite behavior at first, but realized there really wasn't much else they could do. They had a job to do, and shoving things over was the only way. I picked a stack and started going through it, just trying to orient myself. The boxes were randomized. There was no telling what you would find inside. In one box, I remember finding a hand-cranked mixer, a few dinged-up metal measuring cups, and some old spoons with ornamental decorations on them. In another box, I found books published before I was born, but in a pristine condition. Practically brand new except for some dust. Some boxes had labels like kitchen stuff and office and fragile, typical recycled moving boxes. I actually did a double take because one box said Marlini's stuff. Marlini was the nickname given to Grandma by Grandpa. That alone wasn't what caused my double take, but finding a second box with the exact same handwriting did. The line under the first E was missing on both of them. The handwriting was so similar that it looked like a literal copy and paste. I thought I'd gotten turned around in there, but I hadn't. It was 2 boxes marked exactly the same in exactly the same place. After opening one box and finding some vintage, nearly sealed comic books, I started to wonder why Grandpa had been collecting so many random items. The comic books probably weren't cheap, especially nowadays. What was his pattern? This stuff hadn't been in the house before, so it's not like he'd emptied out his storage and rearranged it here. He was intentionally going out and getting these odd items just to store around the house. Why? Looking for pictures became less of a priority because I wanted to see what other strange but interesting things Grandpa would have hoarded. I went around the house trying to find a pattern to the stacks. I was sorting through a box of child's toys when a stack near the front door toppled over out of the corner of my eye. It made me freeze because I hadn't been near that stack in a while. "Hello?" I said out of habit, regretting it immediately. No answer, just the rustle of settling garbage. I stood up and walked cautiously over to the stack, watching for a rat or something that could have been climbing on it when it fell. No movement. I kicked something and bent over to look at it. It was a long, high-end flashlight. I scooped it up and clicked the switch. The light was damn near blinding. My eyes had accustomed so much to the dark that the flashlight was almost too bright. I decided to keep it on while I looked. All the curtains were closed, and I hadn't had the sense to even open one or crack a window. I was too wrapped up in my curious search. The break from searching brought me back to my original purpose: pictures. Using the flashlight, I skimmed over the trash on the floor, looking for maybe some discarded pictures among the grime. I opened drawers in the entertainment center, and the table behind the armchair, and even the kitchen drawers. Nothing. Hesitantly, I pointed the flashlight down the hall. I'd avoided going down there because Grandpa's room was at the end of it, and that's where his body was found. It gave me the creeps to even think about going over there. But if family pictures were going to be kept anywhere, it would either be in the bedroom or the office, both of which were down the hall. Stepping over yet another pile toppled by the coroner or whoever picked up his body, I made my way down the hall. The door to my right, just before the hall started, made me stop. The basement would be an even better place to keep family pictures. I could avoid going into his room by looking here first. The door was shut, and the wood was stained. It was a white door originally, if I remembered right, but now it was brown and grimy with neglect. The only clean part was the handle, clearly used often enough to keep even the dust away. It surprised me that the basement would even be used at all, since Grandpa had a hard time using the stairs on the front porch. Years ago, before Grandma died, Dad had come and helped him finish their basement with a nice carpet, fresh paint, a fireplace, and some seats for movie night downstairs. We'd used it frequently before the relationship fell apart. I remember Dad saying it was a shame the basement couldn't be used more often since Grandpa started having difficulty with stairs. I could also tell the door was used often because I didn't have to kick anything away on the floor to get the door open. There was a circle of cleanliness where the door stood, allowing it to swing wide and fully open. On the other side was a set of fresh carpeting leading to a second door at the bottom of the stairs. I frowned and turned on the light switch in the stairway. The light jumped to life, filling the entire area. The light blasted back into the darkness of the room behind me, giving the room an even more sinister look. What surprised me the most was how clean it was. The carpet was pristine, no dust or grime. The stairs were stark white, and the light wasn't dimmed at all like the others in the house. I turned around, using the flashlight to look around the room behind me for another comparison. The contrast was unreal, like looking into another house. When I turned back to the stairs, I suddenly noticed how brown and gross the doorframe itself was. It was slathered in what I can only describe as oil. Touching it left a sticky residue on my fingers, and pointing the flashlight at it revealed extra colors, just like oil would. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were etched into the drywall and the wood around the door, following an arch from one side up around the other. They were symbols I didn't recognize. Some were alphabet characters, but others may have well been squiggles. I leaned in closer to get a better look, and right before my eyes, they faded. The wall became smooth again. I frowned and stepped back, pointing the flashlight at them, and they reappeared, digging themselves into the wall like a stamp would press ink into paper. I stared at them for a little while longer, trying to figure out what trick my eyes were playing on me, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The reaction was uncontrollable. I yelped at the top of my lungs, clutching my leg and dropping the flashlight. The symbols faded away as the flashlight tumbled down the stairs. "Damn it," I muttered, picking up my phone and controlling my breathing again. Jake was calling me. "Yeah?" I answered. "Hey, where are you?" "Getting pictures, like I said." "Still?" "Yeah, they're hard to find. I don't think you remember how much of a hoarder Grandpa was." "Dude, it takes 4 hours to find pictures?" "Whatever. Mom says grab dinner for everyone if you're ever coming home." Yeah, I'm coming. I'll have to come back tomorrow to keep looking then." "You didn't find any pictures?" "No, this place is a mess. You need to come help me tomorrow." Yeah, sure. We'll just get Panda on your way home. I'll text you what we want." "Sure, bye." I hung up and looked at the time. Sure enough, I had spent 4 hours digging through Grandpa's belongings. Where the hell had the time gone? Sighing, I stuffed my phone back into my pocket and started to go downstairs to grab the flashlight. I got about halfway before I stopped. Something didn't feel right. I felt myself feel more and more sluggish. My mood was dropping, and I began to feel worse and worse as I went down. By the time I got to the bottom, my feet on either side of the flashlight, I felt like there was no point in even grabbing it. The batteries would die eventually anyway, so why bother even turning it off to be used another day? And why bother coming back at all? It's not like people don't remember what Grandpa looked like. The pictures were useless. It took a lot of mental stamina to bend over and pick up the flashlight. I clicked it off and began to ascend the stairs. If going down had brought my mood down, going up brought me anxiety. I began to feel panic rise within the first few steps. Something was behind me, I was sure of it. I whipped my head around 3 times the whole way, watching for something to be crawling up the stairs behind me. Nothing was there. I couldn't move my legs fast enough as I bolted up the last few steps. I put my hands on the top level and practically pulled myself up. My legs were tensed, just waiting for something to grab my ankle at the last second. I whipped around at the top and slammed the door shut with a loud bang. The noise startled me and I yelped again. "You alright?" someone asked from the living room. I twisted around, hands shaking hard. I couldn't keep the flashlight in my grip. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, staying off. "Jake?" I rasped. "Jesus, Mark, you good?" he said, concerned. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked. "You told me to meet you here." He stumbled along, giving me a concerned look. I sucked in a few extra breaths, trying to think. "Did the big scary house freak you out?" he mocked, cracking a grin. I didn't respond. I just whipped out my phone, intending to show him that he had called only a second ago, and that he couldn't be here because Mom and Dad's house was an hour away. My jaw hung open, shaking. The time said 1 p.m. The date said the 20th. But today was the 19th. It was 5 p.m. on the 19th when Jake called me. With difficulty, I opened my call history. There was definitely a call from Jake at 5 p.m. on the 19th, but the current date was wrong. It had to be. "You okay?" he asked, frowning. I'm not sure," I muttered, looking up at him. "Did I come home last night?" I asked. "Yeah." "I brought home the Panda Express?" "Mark, seriously, are you okay?" I stared at the closed door to the stairs. The symbols weren't there. The door handle was still clean as always. The door was still slathered in the luminescent oil. "I must be going crazy," I whispered to myself. I shook my head a few times, trying to figure out what had happened. "What do you mean, crazy?" Jake asked. "I got off the phone with you, went downstairs to pick up the flashlight I dropped, and then came back up, and you were here. I went downstairs yesterday and came back upstairs today. A whole day went by." Jake's expression confirmed that I actually was going crazy. "I need some air," I said, clutching my chest. I turned toward the back door to leave, and slipped. "Whoa," Jake said, before I even hit the ground. The impact knocked the breath out of me, and I had to suck in short breaths. Jake walked over and crouched next to me. "You good?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. He nodded back, then leaned over to pick up what I'd slipped on. A black, leather-bound book about an inch thick. I'd been stepping on so many things in this house that I hadn't noticed one more piece of garbage. Jake undid the ribbon holding the book closed, and skimmed. "Looks like Grandpa's diary," he said, flipping through it. "It's got some wicked old handwriting, some cursive shit." I held out a hand and he passed it to me. I laid it on the ground so I could look at it. He was right. The handwriting was in that tiny cursive style that's difficult to read nowadays. It didn't help that the paper and ink had faded severely. This must have been one of his super old journals, because it looked like it was decades old. Squinting, I tried to read the contents. I can't say now that I remember what it said, but it was definitely written in the style of a journal, but with the pace and feel of a newspaper article. Grandpa's beloved career bled even to his personal life. "It's definitely Grandpa's journal," I said, finally able to breathe properly. I sat up to page through it. The floor was sticky on my arms and pants, but I ignored it. Jake stood up and looked at the table beside the back door, probably looking for pictures. I was skimming from one page to another, just trying to get a gist of the time frame and importance. I came to a page in the middle that stopped me. This page wasn't covered with words, it was covered with a drawing. A single door and door frame, with an arch made of symbols going around it. I glanced up from the journal to the door. The symbols weren't visible now, but they had been before, and I recognized the symbols from the book. Grandpa had put these symbols there, matching what he wrote in his journal. I had no idea why, either. Jake saw me hesitate and came to look. He glanced at the book, then at the door I was facing on the floor. "What's that?" he asked. "That door has the same symbols as this one," I said absently, brain thinking and trying to connect the dots. "No, it doesn't," Jake replied. I grunted and leaned over to grab the flashlight from the door. With one click of the button, it came to life. I pointed it at the door, and the symbols imprinted themselves into the wall and frame. "What the fuck?" Jake whispered, walking up to the door. Wherever he blocked the light, the symbols smoothed themselves back into the wall. I also stood up, aiming the flashlight around him while trying to verify that the symbols matched. When I was satisfied with that, I flipped to the page previous to try and get some context. Jake, an idiot of action, opened the basement stairwell door. I expected the light to be blinding, but the stairwell light was off. I hadn't turned it off when I came upstairs. Jake started to descend, a hand on the light switch. "Wait!" I called out, stepping forward and intending to pull him back. He took another step before hesitating, but 2 steps was enough. It was like slow motion. Jake looked back at me, then his ankle gave out. He dropped, hit the top of the stairs, and began to fall. I ran forward to grab onto him, but that was a mistake. His flailing arms caught hold of my hand and he didn't let go. We both tumbled head over heels down the stairs. I tried to yell, but my breath was knocked out of me again. We rolled down into the dark, the air around us becoming darker and darker with every step. Finally, we smashed onto the door at the bottom, coming to a stop. I groaned heavily at the soreness in every limb and especially in my back. Jake didn't make any sound at all, didn't even try to move. "Jake," I hissed, trying to untangle myself from him. He was limp. 2 words fought for precedence in my head. Dead or unconscious, dead or unconscious. I managed to get free enough to lean over his crumpled body and shake him. "Jake! Jake!" I yelled, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. No response. I put a finger to his nose and waited. There was breath. He was breathing, thank God. Okay, I muttered to myself, looking around to get oriented. The journal had fallen halfway up the stairs, crumpled by our bodies. I needed to get Jake to a hospital. His spine could be injured, or something worse could have happened. I put my arms under his own arms, and lifted him off his crumpled position, up so he was laying against the stairs. I felt hopeless, like I'd never get him out of here. I just wanted to give up and let someone find us. Maybe the neighbor would come over and find us. I wouldn't have to try so hard then. Instead of giving in, I sat on the stair behind him, slipped my arms under his, intertwined my fingers around his chest, and pulled up. I forced his butt onto the next stair and steadied him. Then I scooted up one more step and pulled him up another. Progress. This was progress. I scooted up a few more stairs. We were halfway up. I went up another step and landed on the crumpled journal. I angrily brushed it aside and kept going, pulling Jake up the stairs. We had about a third of the way to go when I had to stop and listen. My eyes were drawn to the bottom of the stairs where the doorknob on the basement door flickered some light. The circular handle was turning. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," I couldn't help whisper chanting, scooting up 2 stairs at a time and pulling. This was a mistake because I couldn't lift him up 2 whole steps. I had to scoot back down 1 more to pull him up. My heart was pounding in my chest again. The same level of anxiety I felt last time I went up these stairs returned. A click at the bottom of the stairs made me lose my grip, and Jake almost slid back down the stairs. I was panting as I regained my grip and went up another step. The door at the bottom opened up, and while the bottom of the stairs had been dim, the room beyond the door was black as pitch. It opened 1 inch, then another. then slowly opened to a 6-inch gap. I tried not to look. I tried not to be mesmerized by something I didn't understand, but I couldn't look away even while I struggled to pull Jake up another stair. I saw a distortion in the air for a fraction of a second, before Jake started to slip again. But this time he wasn't just falling, he was being pulled. I watched one of his ankles lift off the ground and aim towards the basement door like a needle in a compass. It hung suspended that way, and I pulled back, scooting up another stair. When I tried to make Jake follow me, his body wouldn't budge. In a sudden burst, his body was ripped out of my grasp. He bounced back down the stairs, led by his single leg. His arms bounced off the stairs, limp. He slid faster than we had fallen, pulled by something unseen. I watched helplessly as his body was dragged straight through the door. The movement of his body hitting the door caused it to slam open, straining the wood at the hinges. I heard them crack a little as Jake's body disappeared straight into the darkness. The door was left hanging wide open, barely twitching from the leftover kinetic action. My mouth trembled, and I could barely process how quickly his body had been sucked into the darkness. Without warning, the basement door suddenly slammed shut. The force was so strong that the flashlight I had dropped at the bottom of the stairs gave way and clattered harshly all the way down the stairs, coming to rest against the door. The light illuminated one of the walls. Then, everything was silent again. My inability to move only lasted a second. I ran down the stairs, stopping myself against the door and twisting the handle. My ribs were still hurting from our tumble down the stairs. "Jake! Jake!" I yelled, trying to make my fingers grip the knob. It was slippery since my hands were covered in that black grime from the upstairs. The knob wasn't budging, not even a wiggle. It wasn't locked, it was being held shut. I pounded the door harshly with my fist, leaving black marks on the white wood. "Jake!" I screamed. Suddenly, the handle twisted, and the door swung open with my full weight behind it. I managed to stop myself from going forward past the threshold as the door slammed against the wall with its full force. I felt my heartbeat in my ears as I stared into a blanket of darkness. I could see a few feet of carpet before me, before it was absorbed into the black. The flashlight, still on, could only penetrate so far. It was pointed at the wall to my right, and its reflection did more to fight the dark than the faint light at the top of the stairs. I scooped up the light and pointed it into the basement. The amount of normalcy was odd. The fireplace glass reflected a light back at me. The couch and armchair cast soft shadows on the wall beyond. The floor was clean and untouched. No grime, no stacks of boxes, no sign of misuse or disuse. It looked just like the last time we left it. "Jake," I whispered, moving the flashlight around the room. To the left of the fireplace and seating was what used to be the laundry room, and to the left of that was the bathroom. If I rounded the corner to my left and followed the short hallway back, it would lead to a large storage room. To my right, and all around the corner, was another short hallway with 2 more small spare bedrooms. All the doors I could see were closed. Jake could be anywhere down here, behind any door, and whatever dragged him here could be hiding anywhere. There were 2 blind spots on either side of me that it could jump out of when I crossed the threshold. I wanted to just give up, sit down on the stairs, put my head in my hands, and just close my eyes. No reason to continue. No reason to subject myself to this horror. No reason to go and get anyone to help. It was over. I was done for. A rustling behind me made me spin around. The journal slid forward a couple more inches, then dropped off the stair it was on. It bounced a few times before coming to rest 3 steps behind me. I glanced into the basement, then risked looking back to grab the journal. It had fallen open to a specific page. In large capital letters, not cursive, but blocky, I read the words, "Don't give up." The ink was equally faded like the rest of the book. Grandpa's motivation. "Okay," I breathed, holding my sore ribs with one arm. And before I could stop myself, I took several steps into the basement. With the flashlight, I whipped my eyes around the entire place. I was in the middle of the room with full view of both hallways and all doors. No one was down here. It wasn't entirely unexpected when the door to the basement slammed shut. I still jumped, but it wasn't as startling as it should have been. When the sound of the slamming door stopped echoing, there was silence again. I used the flashlight to look over the room again, unwilling to walk from my central vantage point. The flashlight painted the room in a starchy white light. The directional light source didn't do much to illuminate the entire room. I pulled out my phone, dragged down on the lock screen, and activated my flashlight so I could have a second source. But the light barely did anything. The phone's light was so weak that it only reached my arm a few inches away before vanishing. What the hell? My phone was utterly useless down here. Somehow. Instead of wasting the battery, I turned off my phone's light and put it back in my pocket. I pretended not to panic at the date and time. My phone claimed it was the 23rd. Almost 4 entire days had passed since I first entered Grandpa's house. My hand swept the flashlight back over the door and my stomach sank. The door looked off. I angled my head, trying to figure out what was wrong. In a panic, I ran over to it and put my hands to the door. It was now perfectly smooth, where before it had 4 indented rectangles on it. My hands outlined the door and my fingernails dug in to confirm what I was seeing. The door was no longer a door, but a wall painted to look like one. The handle was just a painted silver circle. Totally flat, no cracks, just a wall with paint on it. I would have panicked if that feeling of helplessness hadn't returned, keeping my heart rate slow and my brain foggy. How was this possible? How was any of this possible? Was I dreaming? Was I drugged? Was the dark playing tricks on me and I was actually feeling up a wall where there was never a door here? I felt for the light switch that I knew was just around the corner from the door. Instead of a light switch, there was a hole in the wall. The unexpected texture made me jump. I peered around to verify. The light switch was indeed missing. It was completely torn out of the wall, probably by whatever was here. I stepped back to think, and felt the carpet stick to my shoe. Pointing the flashlight, I inspected the carpet. The black grime from upstairs formed a line away from where the door had been and into the middle of the room. There, it stopped. I stared at the end point, just a few feet away. Whatever had grabbed Jake had been invisible, so was he now invisible too? It didn't seem so far-fetched after everything that had happened so far. Cautiously, I stepped on the spot where the trail ended. Nothing. I leaned in closer to get a better look, and noticed that the trail didn't really end there, it just changed. It went from a line, which was actually 2 staggered lines, to small splotches spaced along the carpet. I followed them closely as they led to the hall on my now left where the 2 spare bedrooms were. They came to a stop in front of the spare bedroom closest to the main room, the first spare room. Once again, I swept my flashlight all around the room, expecting a trap, expecting something to pop out and grab me now that I'd followed its breadcrumb trail. But nothing did. My hands were full, so I secured the journal under my arm that held the flashlight. The door handle twisted normally under my slimy hands, and I was able to pull it open a gap to peer inside, flashlight pointed. Behind the door was supposed to be a spare room with a twin bed, a dresser, and a closet. That's what it was the last time I remembered it. Instead, I found yet another staircase, exactly the same as the one I'd just come down. Perfectly maintained carpet, white walls, white door, and a single light fixture. I tapped the switch on the wall and the light turned on. The light spilled up into the room I was in, adding to the glow of my flashlight. As far as I knew, most basements didn't have a second level, and unless Grandpa had come and built a second set of stairs, this had absolutely been a spare bedroom before this. Then again, the door back upstairs had disappeared. Nothing was making sense here. The trail of slime stopped at the threshold. There was no grime on the stairs leading down. The door at the bottom was closed and untouched. This didn't feel right, though. Things had been happening so quickly that I felt a need to take things more slowly. So, I sat at the top of the stairs, gave one more cautious look around the basement, and cracked open the journal. I skimmed to where I thought the page with the drawn door was. I used it as a type of bookmark to go off of. I decided to work forwards through the book. The next page was the same cursive scribbles, all in neat lines and rows. Try as I might with every angle of the flashlight, I couldn't read the text. It was just too faded, and the handwriting was too obscure. The next page was a quickly sketched shape. It took me a few minutes to realize that it was an outline of the basement. The fireplace, couch, bathroom, storage room, laundry room, and 2 bedrooms were labeled. Even the stairs were labeled, but they were called entrance. Each door labeled had a series of X's and O's next to it. I counted them, and it was well over 20, and they were all the same amount. Every door had the same combined number of X's and O's. But why? And what did they mean? I counted which doors had the most O's. It was obvious to me that X's would be bad and O's would be good. But good and bad for what? The door that had the most O's was the one in front of me, the one the splotches of grease led to. Curious, and trying to figure it out, I got up and went to the other spare bedroom. This one only had 4 O's. I set the journal on the floor, readied my flashlight, and opened the door. The opening led to yet another staircase, the exact same one. I left the journal on the floor and sped to the laundry room door, opened it to find another staircase, and another one for the bathroom, and another one for the storage room. 5 doors, all staircases, identical. There were no marks to distinguish any of them. I ran the flashlight over the door frames, and no symbols appeared. I turned on all of their lights so I could illuminate the room better and think. I brought the journal over to the middle of the room so I could see all the stairs. The light from all 5 staircases made the room have a yellowish glow, broken up by the harsh white of my flashlight. The first spare bedroom had the most O's. The second spare bedroom had less. The bathroom and the storage room were tied, and the laundry room was either above or below the second spare bedroom. I decided to stick with my count of the O's theory. That would mean I'd go down the first spare bedroom. Nodding to myself, I picked up my 2 supplies and marched to the stairs. I hesitated at the top, doubting my decision, then plowed ahead, stomping down the steps. I doubted myself more and more as I descended until I got right to the door. The handle was coated with black oil. This had to be it. I threw open the door to be faced with yet another wall of complete darkness. This time, it wasn't as bad because the light of the stairwell spilled into the room beyond. My eyes adjusted to the dark while I pointed the flashlight into the room. It was yet another basement. An identical basement. Fireplace, couch, armchair, closed doors, all the same. I'd gone from Grandpa's basement to my grandpa's basement. What the hell? I lost all caution and ran into the room, throwing the flashlight along the walls to make sure no one was there. I threw open every door. They were all the same. Staircase, 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 staircase. 5 identical stairs. When I had turned on all the lights and stopped to catch my breath, I noticed that the door I'd entered through had closed itself and sealed again. Just a painted door. And, to my dismay, there were no more grease stains. The room looked the same as it had in my childhood. No signs of which way Jake had been dragged. Shit. I opened the journal again for some kind of clue. The diagram remained the same. A series of X's and O's next to every door. I counted them again, wishing I had a pen of my own so I could write notes. About 30 total at each door. All the same number still. As I stared at the page, I noticed there were several signs of ripped paper at the spine. Multiple pages before this one had been ripped out. On closer inspection, the X's and O's were written in pencil and had been erased and rewritten in different orders. The light of all the stairs made it easier to see the faint markings of the erased pencil. The diagram had been worked on, heavily, adjusted, tested. It was already clear that this was a maze of some kind, somehow. I tried to ignore the supernatural aspect of it and focus on solving the problem. Going back the way I came was not an option. The doors sealed themselves, which meant I had better have made the correct choice this time, or I was screwed. It wasn't clear how Grandpa had made multiple attempts on the maze like the erased marks indicated, but he had battle-tested this maze and mapped it. And, crossing my fingers, this map was complete and not a work in progress. Or, I didn't want to think about the alternative. Focus on what I can control. I tried turning a few pages into the book, looking for more clues about this maze. More faded handwriting. More diagrams that didn't look familiar. It looked like, even if I got to the end of this maze, there would be more. The hopelessness was crushing. I'd never felt more hopeless before. For a few minutes I considered propping the couch up and letting it drop on my head to kill myself. I don't know how long I stared at the chart, turning it around, trying to analyze the erased marks, before I finally had an epiphany. I was staring at the door I'd used the first time, and analyzing the sequence of marks. It was the only door with an O next to it as its first mark. It wasn't the number of X's and O's. It was the order. All the doors had the same total number of marks, 30 marks, 30 stages, 30 doors. Each stage only had one O, and that was next to a door. The markings were stages to take, and, thanks to the grease stains on the carpet, I had taken the correct first step. I checked my work to be sure. Each stage only had one O, and that was next to a specified door. No stage lacked an O, or had two of them. Time to follow the map. I looked for the second O, and found it at the laundry room. I turned toward the open doorway to my right, and crossed the entrance. Down I went, looking for any more signs of oil stains. I found it on the door handle. That confirmed to me that I was going the right way. With a bolster of strength, weighed down by a renewed desire to sit down and give up, I turned the handle and thrust it open. Yet again, another black basement. The flashlight confirmed all the same features: fireplace, couch, armchair, closed doors. Yet another stage in the maze. I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me and became a painted door. The dark returned and I was left with nothing but my flashlight and journal for a guide. Every door contained staircases. Once they were all opened, I consulted my map. Next would be the storage room. Again and again I descended. After the fourth room, the grease stopped appearing on the door handles, but finding the grease that many times in a row confirmed my faith in the map. There was no going back, only forward. Every slammed door that melted out of existence sealed me further into my progress. This would either lead somewhere, or trap me forever. Every time I went down a set of stairs, my despair would flare up again. What would happen when I got to the last stage, opened the door, and found another basement? I'd have no direction, no greasy handles leading me on, no idea where to go next. The page that said "Don't give up" from Grandpa lent me a lot of comfort. If he could do it, so could I. The man who he had used to be was guiding me. The one who pointed out errors in my stories, making them better with every review. The man who encouraged me at every turn when I felt discouraged before. When I felt bad that something I showed him wasn't up to his standards, he boosted me up. And now, every set of stairs I descended, I let his handwritten words boost me up again. I was down to my last few stages when I remembered the light switch. I hadn't even looked for it after finding it ripped out of the wall. I'd simply opened every door, turned on every light in each stairway, and relied on that for light. Curious, I searched for the light switch in this stage, and it was there, intact. Whatever had come down this way hadn't destroyed this one. I sighed in relief, happy to have more light on my journey. With one finger, I flipped the switch to the on position. The ceiling light above the couch didn't turn on. Instead, there was a deep rumbling that shook the room. My finger was frozen on the switch. I realized that I may have just completely fucked myself. Everything had been going fine. Now I'd never get out of... The light fixture exploded downward, forced by pressure from above. The glass barely had time to shatter before it was pushed around by a flow of water. The stream forced itself down from the ceiling in a large column. The ceiling was starting to form cracks from the sheer force of the water that came down. I flinched, startled, and watched with horror and curiosity as the water spread outward, faster than a hole in a ship. The water lapped past my ankles and began to drain down the stairs of all 5 doors. By the time I got my wits together, the stairways had already collected several inches of water. There was no sign of stopping. It was no odder than the door completely vanishing behind me, but still it held me with curiosity. How? I thought. I saw how quickly the stairwells were filling with water. Before long, the entire room would be flooded. I'd be completely trapped, and I doubted the water would stop until the entire basement was flooded. My hands fumbled with the journal, shaking heavily. I almost dropped the already faded text into the water. That would have spelled disaster. The next door was the laundry room again. The door closest to the waterfall, of course. The rapidly flowing water was disorienting as I waded through the ankle-deep stream into the laundry room. The carpet squashed under my shoes, not able to absorb enough of the water to make a difference. The water was cascading down the stairs in dizzying display. I placed my hands on each side of the wall to keep from slipping while I descended. The journal was kept high above the water's reach, along with my heavy flashlight. My arms became quickly sore, but I took my time. One misstep and both me and my equipment would be underwater. The pool at the bottom of the stairs had risen several feet already. If I didn't move fast enough, it would be above my head soon. I finally touched the last step just as the water was up to my stomach. I traded my hands so that my equipment was all in one hand, then tried the handle with my free hand. It twisted easily, and before I knew it, the door was forced open by the weight of the water. I was thrust into the room with the force of a broken dam. I managed to toss the journal and the flashlight toward the fireplace, where they landed away from the reach of the rising tide, for now. The water was still streaming into the room, and the door wasn't sealing itself. The waterfall down the stairs only seemed to increase. Every time the door started to close, the force of the water would push it back open. Apparently, whatever force closed the doors was too weak to seal it this time. Clothes soaked, hair dripping, I got to my feet. The room was dimmer than usual because the flashlight was partially obscured by the journal. Something about the overwhelming sound of several waterfalls and the near dark opened a primal fear inside me. I began to panic. Running to the fireplace, I snatched my things before the water could spread that far. A quick glance around the room with my flashlight told me that I was still in danger. The water was already rising against the brick fireplace and probably accelerating. The waterfall down the stairs was relentless, turning from a cascading splash to a steady flow. I wiped my wet hands on my soaked clothes to try and clear my dripping hands off before I opened the journal to find the next door. I'd have to be fast. Next door was the storage room. Holding the journal and flashlight high above my head, I splashed quickly to the storage room and threw open the door. Immediately, water began running down the stairs, starting out as a rivulet but quickly growing. I bolted down the stairs, taking them cautiously but quickly. The water was only a couple inches high by the time I got to the bottom. The pool spread out into the next basement immediately. The carpet began to soak up the water and squelched under each step. I stepped back, waiting for the door to seal itself and stop more water from coming, but it didn't move. It stayed wide open, allowing the stairs to become yet another waterfall. There was nowhere else for the water to go except to follow me. There were no other staircases to fill in the room directly above since I hadn't opened their other doors. With the door in one hand, I pushed it closed against the flow of water. It struggled toward the end as the pressure built, but I managed to get the door to shut completely. I heaved a sigh of relief, but it was cut short when I realized the door was only closed, not sealed. The handle was still there. When I let go of the wood, the door suddenly whipped open again, hitting my shoulder and almost knocking me down. Gallons worth of water flooded into the room, forcing the door to stay open. The latch hadn't even caught on the door jamb. On closer inspection, the door jamb didn't even have a hole for the latch to embed into. The door couldn't stay closed, even if I managed to shut it again. I was wasting time. I needed to get ahead of this water. Going from door to door, I threw them all open and turned on the light. The flashlight illuminated the glitter of the wet carpet as I went. The threat glinted white light back at me as I rushed. Once all the doors were open, the water was at ankle height again. I was wasting time, but I hoped it would buy me some in the next few stages of the maze. As I made my way to the second spare room, the next staircase in the maze, I noticed that the first spare room was already filling up. The water felt unnaturally fast. How quickly would this fill up under normal circumstances? I pushed away all my rational thought and focused purely on survival. The water in the next stairwell made a loud splash when I jumped the last few steps. While opening the door, I pictured the map. There were 10 more to go. The journal pointed me to the bathroom next, and I followed, ignoring the other doors. I sped down the still dry stairs, throwing open the door, rounding the corner, and went to the next spare bedroom. Bathroom, laundry room, first spare bedroom, laundry room again, storage room. I stopped as I burst through the bottom of the stairs of the storage room. I was out of breath from all the stairs. I flipped open the journal and traced the next door, but I couldn't find it. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. The storage room was the next door. The door I should have taken was the laundry room for a second time. I'd been in such a rush that I'd mistaken the second laundry room mark as the one I'd already taken. All of this crossed my mind in the fraction of a second. Fear seized me and it seemed like a dream. I moved like I was underwater. My limbs were lethargic as I tried to spin around and go back. My eye caught the door jamb. There was a hole for the latch now. This fucking maze. The door started to move. I dove forward, arm outstretched to grab the door. My arm slipped past the door frame. The door slammed on my forearm like a sledgehammer. I screamed but didn't recoil. My other hand, holding the journal and flashlight, shoved the door open again, and I rolled onto the first few stairs. The door slammed shut behind me, changing from a door to a wall imperceptibly. I dropped my equipment and clutched my arm. It was bleeding and an irritated red. The bleeding was minor. I was shocked that a door had broken the skin at all. The bruising that was building up already hurt a lot. The sound of water got me moving. With my equipment pressed against my still sore ribs, I fumbled up the stairs. My fear about my arm grew as I ascended. I became worried. What if the injury was worse than it appeared? What if my arm was broken? Water had already begun to seep into the room above. I moved 2 doors down to the laundry room and threw open the door. A little blood spread around my still wet shirt. I clutched my forearm to my chest, trying to ignore the rising pain. The stairs were still dry when I got to the next stage. This door didn't have a latch, and I didn't bother trying to close it. Water was starting to soak the carpet of the first step when I went to the next door. I descended into what should be the final basement. I was sick of this carpet, the same couch, the same fireplace. I'd seen this room so many times it was burned into my brain. I prayed with everything that I had that the next door would take me somewhere else, anywhere else. The first spare bedroom had the last O. I shut the journal, gripped the handle, and threw it open. It was yet another staircase. My disappointment was palpable, but maybe the bottom door would go somewhere else. I looked behind me. The room was dark, but devoid of water. I'd beaten the flow. The door remained wide open, unable to seal itself. I went downstairs, willing with all my strength for the door to lead somewhere else. My hand rested on the door handle and I hesitated. It felt hopeless. No matter what I found on the other side, Jake was gone, Grandpa was dead, and I was trapped. There was no way I could ever do anything that would... I threw open the door. My flashlight reflected back at me. It didn't spill over carpet, but over a hard, reflective floor. Linoleum. Something new. Thank God. I stepped onto the linoleum and looked forward, flicking my flashlight across the new scene. A wall of lockers faced me only a few feet away. They extended into the dark in either direction, so far that my flashlight couldn't follow to the end. I held the door open so it wouldn't shut on me while I looked around. The ceiling was made of tiles with the occasional light fixture, each of them turned off. It was obvious to me where I was. A school hallway. 30 basements led to a school, or something that was supposed to look like a school. "Jake!" I yelled into the empty hallway, hoping this would be the point where I could find him and go home. No response. The echo of water began to trickle down the stairs behind me. I looked back up the stairs to see the glint of water as the carpet absorbed what it could, dumping the rest down each stair in series. There wasn't a choice. I had to continue. I stepped backwards into the hall, and the door slammed shut on its own. The echo followed the length of the hallway in both directions. The closed door on this side resembled an old-time classroom door made of heavy wood with a large frosted glass panel. No name was etched onto the glass, and the nameplate beside the door was empty. There was a few feet of brick on either side and above the door, and the rows of red metal lockers started after that. The door still existed and wasn't just a painting of a door. I put my hand to the wood, feeling for the vibration of water pressure behind it. Nothing. No water seeped under the door either. After turning around, my flashlight followed the row of lockers, but I still couldn't see the end in either direction. 2 options, right or left. I already had a guide that hadn't led me astray so far. The linoleum was cool as I sat and leaned against a locker. Balancing the journal on my knees, I turned to my bookmark page, turned past the basement section, and found a new diagram I hadn't recognized before. It was several sets of parallel lines that formed a square in the middle, with branches spreading out from there. Every branch devolved into parallel lines that were smaller and smaller until the 2 lines came together into a point. A line was marked entrance, just like the stairs had been. The entrance was on the left arm of the large square. I assumed that's where I was. Underneath the diagram was a list of numbers, followed by a letter separated by commas. 30R, 15R, 45L, 180R, and so on. There were no designated exits or a goal marked on the diagram. Only the entrance was marked. I figured that the R and L, since they were the only 2 letters used, meant right and left, directions. So the first choice would be to go down the hallway to my right. But where else was there a chance to turn? I couldn't see any openings right or left beyond that. The diagram clearly indicated there were corners in this hallway, so where would I go? And what did the numbers mean? Number of lockers? Degrees to turn? I turned back a page or 2 to hopefully get some context, to try and read the text again to see if I could make anything out. I frowned, confused at how clear the text now was. The pencil marks were dark and fresh. My fingers even smeared the pencil a little, as if I was handling the writing that someone had just given me. The diagram of the basement was incomplete. Only 10 marks and lots of chicken scratch notes and arrows that had been erased thoroughly before, replaced with perfect cursive. The journal was changing. I was looking at an earlier version of the basement diagram, a work in progress. How? The notes on the opposite page were much easier to read, though I still struggled through the handwriting. They were bullet points, all jammed together and full of abbreviations. I didn't understand most, but some I could understand because of what I'd gone through. Bring pencil. Bring white light. Other specks absorb. No light main room. 5 rooms, all stairs. Style changes, number doors don't. Don't sit on furniture. Fireplace sealed. No light in the main room, aka don't use the fucking light switch. That would have been nice to know earlier. Fireplace is sealed, which I hadn't even thought to try and use as an escape. Don't sit on the furniture, which I hadn't done, and now suspected it was another trap like the light switch. The notes seemed obvious to me now. Why would you spend time to write down how many doors there were in each room? I could see needing to specify bring a white light. The flashlight was definitely white. Was that why my phone hadn't worked? It wasn't wide enough? I suddenly remembered that I had my phone, and my stomach sank as I felt how wet my clothes were. Sure enough, when I fished my phone out of my pocket, it was dead. No response from any buttons. The water had killed it. I wondered what day it was, but realized it didn't really matter anyway, and put my phone back. So the page in front of me was a work in progress by Grandpa. He'd only tested a few pathways. The journal, or this page at least, had gone back in time. In fact, the only consistent part of this entire experience seemed to be the messed up time. Skipping ahead several hours or days when I didn't even notice the change, certain pages of the journal going from super old and extremely faded to bright and fresh. Something was up with the time down here. There were other bullet points where I understood the words but not the meaning. Leave PG at door at enter. Mem blank at enter. Leave and remember. Emote. CHNG stare. ANX up. Depress down. There were so many empty lines as well that had been full before. Grandpa must not have written those yet. Once I had deciphered all I could on that page, I went back to the diagram outlining the current hallways. The numbers had to be lockers. Degrees wouldn't tell me how far to go. I had a direction and a distance. I could start. Standing up, I wanted to get going fast. Jake could still be in this part of the basement. The more time I took, the further away he got. I glanced at the numbers along the top of the lockers, but they were all the same. 146, repeated on every locker over and over. Fine, counting by hand would have to do. I pulled out the journal and reread the first number so I could remember and count without distractions. The page containing his diagram had changed. The text was partially finished again, with fresh pencil lead smearing the opposite page. The first few measurements were still there, and both of the bullet points were legible. Don't lose count. Don't go to small. The last one was the freshest and most worrying. A drop of blood glistened at the end, slightly smeared. It had been almost dissolved before, to the point that I hadn't noticed it. Now it was fresh. Don't go to small what? What was small here? I took a couple of steps back, aiming my flashlight down each side of the black hallway. Nothing but lockers and reflective material. When I looked back down, I saw that the pencil markings had gone backwards. The blood was gone, so was the second bullet point. I stepped forward and watched with fascinated horror as the text wrote itself with every move forward. It erased itself when I went backward. The diagram also grew and reduced in size with the movements. I was living the writing this time. 5 steps forward increased the range of the diagram. The lines imprinted themselves on the pages. Okay, I could do this. With the journal held open in front of me, I walked forward, using my fingers to count off the lockers as I tapped each one. Every 10 lockers, I put a finger in a new page to mark how many sets of 10 I had done. As I walked, I felt myself feel better. Pausing, I looked at my hurt arm and realized that the bruising was going away. My ribs felt fine. They were healing. The further I went, the better they felt. At 30, I stopped and looked around. There was nothing but lockers. I should have a right turn here. While I looked around, a new bullet point scrawled itself onto the page. Choose the right one. Choose a locker. I glanced at the locker my hand was on. I had to turn right. The lockers on either side of it were almost identical. No way to tell if I was right or wrong. Choose the right one. Lowering my hand, I set my fingers to the latch and lifted while pulling. The metal rattled as it spun on hinges to reveal a black space. The flashlight showed me that the inside started out as a normal locker, but then changed to be mirrored. The other side was another locker door. I could pass right through the wall and open the other side. Cautiously, I squeezed my shoulders into the locker and reached my free arm through and felt for the latch on the other side. It clicked, and the other locker swung open freely. Once the confined space became a pathway instead, I gained courage and ducked through the opening. 2 awkward shuffles took me out to the other side, metal pressing against my still wet clothes. I stumbled through to the other side and found myself in an identical hallway to where I had just come from. With a deep sigh, I consulted my journal. Next direction was another right. This was going to take forever. After a few turns, I began feeling confident. Every time I approached the end of the list of directions, a new one appeared along with new lines in the diagram. I was starting to line up the diagram with the directions, and understood that every time I approached a point where the parallel lines converged, I would turn one direction or another. I was avoiding these points for some reason. There was no indication in real life that there was anything there. The hallways went on forever, so far as I could tell. I was counting up to 1,000 when a loud metal bang in the locker my hand rested on broke my concentration. My heart jumped into my throat, and I moved forward 3 lockers to finish my set of 10 and mark my place. With my fingers securely stuck into the journal, I looked back. The locker that had jolted looked normal, nothing out of place. Bang! The one I was touching made the sound this time. After a single noise, the locker fell silent. I hesitated for a few seconds, keeping my hand where it was so I wouldn't lose measurement. Down the hall where I had come from, I could just make out the outline of the open locker door I'd left. Even as I pointed my flashlight down the hall, a low rumbling began to rise, a rhythmic drumming. My heart started to pound, expecting a burst of water from the open locker, or for the ceiling tiles to collapse. As if the sound was a drum roll, something emerged from the open locker I'd left behind. Something short, something humanoid. My jaw clenched as it stumbled out of the locker with very little grace. Almost fell over, but it got moving. Its legs twirled awkwardly along the linoleum. The drumming increased, and I realized that the lockers were banging in unison over where it was. I wanted to run. I wanted to get away, but my feet stayed obediently, not losing count. Don't lose count. I opened the journal and counted how many sets I had done. There were only 6 more sets to go. The thing was pretty far behind. I could make it. I set my hand solidly on each locker as I counted under my breath, following along with my fingers. 10. 20. It was slowly gaining, but I could still make it. The drumming was getting louder as the lockers it passed took up the rhythm. 30. 40. The journal's text jittered forward and backward in time. A letter would appear only to reverse. My body went through flashes of pain. A new bullet point began to write itself. The next direction also appeared. Do, D, don, do, don. 50 sets done. Don't, do, don, don't run, don't run, don't run. 60 steps. My hand was sweaty against the locker. With one motion, I threw open the door. It was an open gap with the inside of a locker on the other side, as expected. I glanced back. The figure was still stumbling along, maybe 20 feet behind. It was coming straight at me. I was the obvious target. Its body looked emaciated, like a person starved down to skin and bones. Its face was still too far away to make out. The brightness of my flashlight didn't help either. The bright light obscured its features. The pounding was louder now as the thing got closer and closer. I shoved through the opening and lifted the latch on the other side. Inside the locker, the noise was deafening. The door swung open, clattering against the locker next to it. I had my hand on the wall, pulling myself through when something moved in front of me. Another one. Another one approached the locker on the other side. There wasn't time. I grabbed both locker doors, having to duck low and spread myself thin to fit in the double locker. The flashlight and the journal both fell out of my grasp as I gripped the interior of the locker doors on either side and slammed them shut. The metal banging began immediately on both sides. They started pulling at the locker doors, but I held them closed. They weren't very strong. My muscles began to cramp as I stooped inside the double locker, holding both doors. The metal on my chest and back felt like it was closing in around me. The roof forced me to crane my neck to the side. Darkness was thick and oppressive. I never thought I had claustrophobia until I was in that locker space. I started to scream, unable to cope in any other way. The banging on each side was perfectly synchronized. They mirrored each other with every attempt on the door and fist on the metal. I closed my eyes, sucking in ragged breath while trying to figure out what to do. The journal laid open at my feet. I prayed to Grandpa, "Please tell me what to do. What do I do?" The journal responded. A new bullet point was scribbled on the paper. "Don't get trapped." I sobbed angrily. A little late for that. Another note appeared, but this one wasn't scribbled as a bullet point. It was in all caps, just like Grandpa's "Don't give up." Push. Push? Push what? I looked at the doors I held shut. The two things were switching between pulling on the door and banging their fists. In fact, the iteration was predictable. A loop. Mirrored. Bang, bang, bang. Pull, pull, bang, bang, bang. Over and over. I waited for my opportunity. I could only put my weight behind one door, so I opted for the one I needed to go through. I'd have to be fast, because the one behind would be pulling right after I got out. Bang, bang, bang. Wait. First attempt to pull. I leaned into it. Second attempt to pull. The latch was loose. I threw myself into it as best I could. The force of the door opening shoved the thing backward. The force was great enough to knock it against the far locker. It writhed on the floor, struggling to right itself. Reaching back into the locker, I snatched up the flashlight and the journal. The far locker didn't open, however. I wasn't about to investigate why. Equipment in hand, I started to run, but halted after only a few steps. Don't run. So I didn't. Hesitantly, I went back to the locker door and began to count the lockers. I kept a close eye on the humanoid who was struggling to stand up again. The lockers continued to bang in unison where it laid. My hand tapped each locker quickly, leading me away from it. 10. 20. It took its sweet time to get up. The thing was slow. 30. 40. The humanoid was up and coming after me now, but the distance was enough to calm my heart. 50. 60. 70. Something loomed out of the darkness ahead as I approached. I hesitated, but it wasn't moving. Every step brought me closer until I could make out its shape. A box sitting in the middle of the hallway. 80. The box had some writing on the side facing me. Hide was written in fat, permanent marker. The E was backwards, and the letters were awkwardly drawn in childish lines. I swallowed hard, approaching the box and unable to turn away or avoid it. If I deviated from my line, which was slightly to the right of the box, my measurement would be off. I looked back, and the thing was far enough away that only its faint outline could be seen. As I came to the box, I watched it carefully. It didn't budge. My eyes flickered to the journal, looking for any advice. On cue, it added a bullet point. Don't hide. Not that hiding in the box sounded appealing, but it was nice to know that my decision was a safe one. As I passed the box, which looked like the size of a shoebox before, but had grown to the size of a dishwasher, I noticed holes cut in the side for gripping and lifting the box. Long rectangles with rounded edges. As I passed, looking the box over with the flashlight, the light suddenly reflected off of two eyes in the box, staring at me. The eyes were white, moist, and reflective. I flinched, my back leg leaving its spot. I managed to keep my front foot down firm, even as the rest of my body jumped against the nearest locker. Don't run, don't run. The eyes followed me until my angle hid them from view. They blinked a few times, watching me without fear. My heart was a battering ram on my ribcage. I kept glancing back, making sure whatever or whoever was in the box didn't follow me. I got to the last step, turned left, opened the locker, and stepped inside. It felt like several hours had passed during the hallways, but for all I knew, it could have been days. especially with the time being screwed up. I never grew tired, though. I was mentally exhausted, but not physically. It wasn't any stranger than the rest of what was going on, but I wondered about it a lot. Was it a sign that I was asleep? I had tried multiple times to wake myself, but nothing had worked. So I pressed on. Several times, lockers would begin banging again. Each time, I looked around with worry, watching for another humanoid to come out of a locker and chase me, but they never did. The bangs from the lockers would always scare me regardless, no matter how many hours I walked, like it was trying to make me lose count. The very last coordinate led me to an actual door. As I approached, I could see the indent in the lockers, indicating a door. I sighed in relief when I recognized the change. The end, I hoped. I couldn't go further, according to the diagram, because soon after this door was a point where the parallel lines came to a point. Suddenly, a locker just a few away burst open, and out dashed another humanoid. This one spun around and slammed the locker closed, pressing against it with his body. It had to have seen my bright flashlight, but it didn't react at first. The locker it was holding shut attempted to open. It leaned against it hard. "Help!" he screamed. It wasn't one of them. It was a person. An actual, living person. My mouth dropped open, and it took me some time to react. I hadn't seen anyone in what felt like days. Now he comes bursting out? It made me suspicious. "Help me hold this!" he yelled at me, holding up one hand to block the flashlight from his eyes. "Who are you?" I said, barely audible over the slamming locker. "It's getting through!" the man screamed as the locker began to slowly open, despite all his efforts. I was frozen. Did I dare let go of the locker and lose count? The door was right there. I could find it. But what if the turn wasn't the door, but the locker before the door? What if the door was just a trick? The maze had me questioning everything. Suddenly, the door burst open, throwing the guy across the hall and into the lockers. One of the things stepped out, but lost its balance and fell. It writhed on the linoleum. The guy was already on his feet and starting to run. "Don't run!" I shouted. He stopped, but the damage was done. The humanoid suddenly gained perfect control again and rolled to its feet. A single leap sent it flying towards the man, making a squeak on the linoleum floor from its bare feet. The guy dove away from the wall, and the humanoid slammed against the lockers and slid to the floor. The impact didn't faze it, but it did slow down again, losing control. "Do not run," I hissed. Sweaty hand pressed hard against the locker. The guy started to stand up and nodded to me. I lifted my hand and kept counting lockers. The guy noticed me counting, but didn't say anything. He must know this is how you navigate. While I counted, slowly approaching the door while the thing twisted round on the floor, the same rumbling from before started up behind us. The guy pulled out his own flashlight from a utility belt, strapped tightly around his waist. He flicked it on, and the hall was flooded with double the white light. A snap brought his light down the hall, outlining the faintest of two figures, moving closer. "I hope you have the next number," he said, watching all three figures. I nodded, not speaking so I could count. As I passed the thing on the floor, the guy followed slowly behind, watching all three behind us. The thing nearest us eventually got to its feet, and the rhythmic drumming picked up as it shuffled after us. I picked up the pace of counting. The number led me right to the door. I kicked myself over not ditching the counting earlier, but there was nothing I could do. The door was like the one I had arrived through, but the word principal was written on the glass. Not stenciled like it should have been, but drawn on crudely with a permanent marker. It looked eerie. I looked back down the hallway before proceeding. The chorus of banging continued to advance on us. It was louder than it had been before. The hallway echoed the bangs, making it into a deafening roar. The effect made me believe I should expect a humanoid twice the normal size to come charging down the hall at me. "Let's go," he urged, pressing into my back. Eager to escape the cacophony, I opened the door and pulled it open. It was heavy, made from thick wood. When the door opened, I half expected to find that familiar set of stairs, but I found a regular principal's office instead. There was a massive desk in the middle of the room, with two guest chairs on my side and a massive swiveling armchair where the principal would sit. I stepped into the room, and the guy followed me, letting the door click shut. The sounds of the hall stopped immediately, like a cricket when you step too close. The sudden silence made me jump. Our two flashlights scoured the room. It was quiet. Bookshelves filled two sides of the wall, perfectly mirrored. Even the contents on each shelf were mirrored across the room. 2 diplomas hung on either side of the office chair behind the desk. 2 windows reflected my flashlight around the room. There was nothing but blackness on the other side of their glass panes. The room was large, but I could see everything in the room. There was no way out of here. Where was I supposed to go next? Out a window? "Where do we go?" he asked, echoing my thoughts. I thought he was talking to me, but when I looked at him, he was fiddling with his utility belt. I had a tool of my own. I set the flashlight between my legs and opened the journal. Grabbing the flashlight again, I held it over the book to see if any new bullet points had appeared. The diagram had changed again. Somewhere along the parallel lines, a new box had appeared outside their reach, with 2 short lines connecting the nearest hallway with the square room. The room I was in, I guessed. As I watched, the room finished drawing itself. Then 2 fat, thick diagonal lines scratched audibly across the box. A big, thick X. My mouth went dry. A new bullet point wrote itself. K. Kno. Kn. The chair in front of me suddenly moved, spinning slowly in my direction. Hey, the guy tapped my shoulder, trying to get my attention. "Yes, I see the chair moving. 1 second, I said, taking a step back to try and get the right time frame for the bullet point. Knock. Knock for... One of those humanoids stood up from the chair, following me with its eyes as it stumbled to the end of the desk. "The room is crossed out. We shouldn't be here," the guy said, fear in his voice. "Knock first." Shit. I threw us backwards, slamming the journal shut. Turning around, I shoved the guy into the door. He caught the handle, twisted it, and ran through the open doorway. Running was a mistake. I was forced through the door as the humanoid threw itself through the door faster than a car. It crashed headlong into the lockers, denting them into unusability. The force sent me skidding along the floor down the hall. I was more terrified than hurt, like being clipped by a speeding bicycle. My flashlight rolled noisily along the floor, light bouncing harshly off the lockers. I saw the guy standing down the hall back where we'd come from. He was posed and ready to run, but the figures behind were closing in, and the one that had rushed us was regaining balance. We needed time to get the door right. "Knock on the door!" I shouted before sprinting down the hallway. Not back the way we came, but forward, toward where the parallel lines would close. The new humanoid took up the chase. The linoleum screeched against its bare feet as it sprinted after me. I ducked at the last second and dove to the right, tucking and rolling. It stopped a few feet past me. The thing stepped back to face me, standing in the middle of the hall while my back pressed against the lockers behind. We were face to face across the hall from each other. My running had also triggered the ones following us, and they advanced, getting closer to the man. He was running to the door when one of them collided into him. I looked away just as they hit the floor. That's when I noticed that my head was several inches above the lockers. I was growing. I scooted 1 foot to the right, away from the door. My head went above the lockers by 2 feet now. The new humanoid watched me carefully and took another stumbling step forward. The lockers were shrinking. I was heading to the point where the parallel lines collided. It was an illusion. The hall looked like it continued on forever, but I knew it wouldn't. Don't go too small. Don't go too small. I crouched and ran forward, toward the shrinking lockers. It tried to anticipate my move and leapt forward to cut me off. Too far. It flew down the hall, shrinking from my perspective as it hit the ground. It spiraled, rolling up the lockers into the ceiling and then down the other side, all while continuing down the hallway like a slide. It eventually met the middle of the hall and disappeared into the vanishing point. I released my breath and stepped back slowly from the end of the hall. The lockers restored themselves to their proper height. The effect was trippy, unnatural. The hall looked perfectly normal. I was having a hard time believing what I had just seen. Not only was time fucked up down here, but so was space. When I spun around, ready for the new threats, I saw the man struggling with one humanoid that had followed him out of the locker. The other 2 figures weren't far behind, and I finally got a good look at them. Another humanoid, and beside it was the box. Every few steps the humanoid took, it would roll over to the next side, approaching us like dice rolling itself. Every step of the box added to the thuds from the lockers. The guy managed to roll on top of the thing he was wrestling and pull away. On his feet, he could get away from it while it squirmed on the ground. He was breathing heavy. "Where'd the other one go?" he asked. "Let's go," I replied, heading for my flashlight. The two were approaching my equipment fast, and I wasn't about to leave them behind. As I reached over to pick up the flashlight I guessed was mine, I noticed a second journal next to the guy's own flashlight. Same size, same leather binding. I looked up at the guy, who was picking up his own flashlight, questions rising. The noise of the approaching creatures made me pick up my journal and back away from the two who were now so close that I could touch them. The guy grabbed his own flashlight and book, backing up beside me. When we had backed up far enough, I closed the door to the principal's office. With my fist, I knocked on the glass. The door opened itself, and I moved aside so it could swing past me. On the other side was a set of perfectly kept stairs. White walls, a light switch, pristine carpet, and a rectangular door at the bottom. I never thought I'd be so happy to see this staircase again. Stepping inside, I flipped the switch to turn on the light. The guy followed closely behind me, obviously familiar with the stairs. He didn't hesitate. He knew what this was. I shut the door behind us and walked downstairs. My adrenaline was high, but I felt capable now. That feeling left more and more as we descended. The guy glanced back at me a couple of times before we even reached the bottom. We met eyes and I could see his expression. He was feeling it too. Hopeless. When we reached the door at the bottom, he opened it without hesitation. The moonlight was startling and bright. We both had to cover our eyes after being indoors for days or weeks. Who knew anymore? Both our flashlights clicked off, and our eyes slowly adjusted to the moon's glare. We stood at the top of another set of stairs, but instead of walls and a roof, it was open sky and a railing on each side, made from white, perfectly painted wood. The carpet was all the same. The stairs had changed their appearance. Beyond the stairs was a clearing, in the woods. From a basement to a school, and now to the great outdoors. It wasn't the weirdest thing we'd seen, but the infinite sky above was disorienting. Behind us was nothing. No doorway, no other stairs, just open air down to the ground a few feet away. Confused, we gripped the railing and walked down together. I hesitated at the bottom before stepping onto the ground. I looked closely. Leaves and dirt all around for several yards. Beyond that, a circle of trees. We stood in the absolute middle of a clearing. I moved aside to let the guy down as well. He followed suit, and we immediately sidestepped away from each other, suspicious. The moonlight allowed us a better view of each other, finally, so we watched each other. I looked over his belt to see what he had. A slot where he'd put his journal, a line of pencils, a measuring tape, the flashlight, a line of string, and a roll of duct tape. All useful items that I would have loved to have had before. Then I looked up at his face, and my jaw dropped open. "How did you know not to run in there?" he asked, pointing back up the stairs. I didn't answer, just stared. It was him. There was no question. "Uncle Bruce?" I finally whispered. His eyes narrowed, then widened. "Mark? Oh my God!" He started to cry, and I did too. We hugged desperately, both of us dropping out all our scared, horrified cries that we'd held for so long. "How?" I sobbed. "How did you get here? You died!" He didn't answer, but waited for us to both stop sobbing, and just sniffle instead. We pulled apart, but stayed close. "I died?" he said in a whisper, as if death would hear him and take him away. "In a car accident. 5 years ago," I explained, wiping my nose. He bit his lip, looking up at the moon and thinking. I followed his eyes and realized there were no stars. Not one. We were definitely not outside. "One night," he said, still staring at the sky. "I was driving home after... God, I don't remember what. I was driving home at night and another car was coming towards me in the other lane. I honked and flashed my lights, but they weren't changing. I hit my brakes and tried to swerve far enough off the road so they wouldn't hit me. I couldn't go too far because there was a drop to the right. At the last second, someone was crossing the road and the car hit them. The body flew past my window and down the hill. The other car snapped out of it and swerved too late. Their car went right down the drop too. I listened in confusion. Bruce had been in a head-on collision with another car at night. His car had flipped and rolled down a hill, smashing everything and everyone inside to bits. I was listening to a scenario where Bruce didn't die but made it home. I called the police, he continued. I stayed and explained what happened. They sent me home eventually and I went to Dad's house instead. Grandpa, I mean. He clarified, looking at me. Grandpa knew what had happened. He said the police had called to let him know. He said he'd make me some tea to let me breathe, but asked me to grab a box of herbal tea from downstairs. He started to cry again, and it was difficult to hear the rest of his story. I went downstairs, and through that second door, and when I went into the main room, I found a body. Bruce sucked in a breath to steady his sobs. It was me. I found my own body, stabbed hundreds of times, blood everywhere. I was wearing this. He gestured to his utility belt. And I was holding the book and the flashlight. I tried to run back and grab Dad, but the door closed itself and turned into a wall instead. I nodded, showing that I knew what he was talking about. I was trapped down there, with my own body. I looked for an escape, but every door had stairs behind it. Everything was sealed. There was no way out. Only down. Luckily, he continued, I had enough sense to think things through before taking the stairs. One wrong turn and I would have been trapped. I read the journal, took the utility belt, took the flashlight, and have been down here ever since. Apparently for 5 years. Bruce sucked in a breath, and we stared at the ground for a while, thinking. Speaking of a journal, he said, reaching to his side, probably should check what we're in for. I agreed, but hugged him tight first. I'm just glad you're alive, I said. He hugged me back. We both pulled out our journals, and I glanced over to compare them. Mine was worn down and dull, the leather was cracked in a couple of places. The pages had evidently been wet and dried before. They were wrinkled and worn. Bruce's journal was new and fresh in comparison. The leather was reflective, the pages straight and clean. If his book was clean and new, and mine was old and ratty, but he took his book into the maze 5 years ago, how did I ever get a hold of it? Was it a duplicate? I turned to the page where the school was and moved over one more. Bruce was watching my pages. Your book has more in it, he said, holding his out to me. Sure enough, the school wasn't nearly as mapped out. It did have something mine didn't, though. Along the parallel lines, there were various X's with numbers. What are those? I asked, pointing to them. He shook his head. I don't know. Not only was the body of his journal newer, but the contents seemed to be too. Significantly less bullet points, both legible and illegible. There's why I didn't know not to run, he commented, pointing to the bullet point, don't run in my book. Mine doesn't have that. And sure enough, it didn't. So the only sensible thing to do was to rely on my journal over his. Mine had better information, though we weren't sure how or why. The page that represented this part of the maze, or so we thought, was drawn out as little dots on the page with the line marked entrance as usual. I tried to get some semblance of scale from the image, but it was impossible to tell. No other landmarks were drawn in, and I couldn't tell what the dots represented. With our flashlights, we traced the edges of our circular clearing. I always hated camping, Bruce said. Dad used to take us all the time to places like this, but I never liked it at night. I stopped and squinted, trying to tell if it was real or just me. The flashlight swept over a part near the edge of the clearing where the light twisted. It angled in an odd shape, bending around something. There was a massive shadow on the trees generated by the effect. Tapping Bruce to get his attention, I showed him. Let's go see, he said, looking at my journal for any more instructions. None. Yet. We trudged forward, trying to keep quiet for no other reason than the eerie silence around us. As we approached, the effect became greater and the shadow grew in size. The closer we got, the more we could make out. The ground underneath the area was also dark. The moonlight was unable to touch it. When we got just a few yards away, I held out my hand for us to stop. The trees themselves were bending now, arcing around this spot in the air. The light was bending around it, but the world also moved. The moon began to slide across the sky at a visibly increased pace. It took my mind back to the lockers that shrunk in size. Another aberration. "Back up," I said, and we did. The moon slowed down until it stayed in one spot. The trees around the spot returned to their positions in space. "My guess is that's a dot," I said, looking at the map. More dots had been drawn in already. A couple of them had faint X's on them that I didn't understand. I tried to match up this dot and the stairs with the marks on the map. Bruce was looking all around, comparing what we'd seen with what was normal. "So if this is this dot," I said, "then there should be another one over there." We moved our flashlights over the spot, but if it was there, we were too far away to see the effect. "But where are we supposed to go?" I wondered. A sudden yell not far away made us freeze. My eyes dropped to the book, hoping and praying for another last-minute addition. I was rewarded with one. "Don't be seen." "Come on," I said, pulling Bruce to the trees. The sound had come from across the clearing. If we stayed here and something came out of the trees, we'd be spotted immediately. We steered clear of the aberration and ducked behind a couple of trees, peering over a couple of bushes that clung to the bottom of the trunk. From here, we had a clear view across the clearing. We turned off our flashlights and had to adjust to the dark again. I kept feeling like something might come out of the trees behind us, so I took turns glancing behind and forward. Bruce was listening intently. Out of the woods, on the other side of the clearing, 2 men wearing tan clothes marched out. They had flashlights and were sweeping the ground as they walked. Their boots snapped every branch and crushed every dry leaf as they went. They were yelling something I couldn't make out. The 2 of them took turns calling the same word over and over. As they came fully into the clearing, one of them stopped mid-step and held out an arm to keep the other back. They stared into the clearing, eyes fixed on the middle, on the stairs. It was the entrance. It was proof that we were here. The maze knew we had arrived, I was sure of it. The 2 men backed away with carefully placed steps. Their eyes didn't turn away until they were well into the trees where we couldn't see them. I turned to Bruce. There was no way we could go back out there now. They'd be waiting in the woods and watching for us. We had no option but to venture further into the woods. He caught my eye and nodded, understanding what we had to do. Silently, we slunk back into the woods. The trek was difficult. The clearing had been on the side of a mountain, and once you got past the tree line, it was a steep decline. Luckily, the hillside was dense with trees, so we could move from tree to tree down the hill. The moon was obscured by leaves, which made the area even darker. After we had left, the 2 men took up their calls again, which I still couldn't make out. It was the same noise over and over. It was so dark that we tripped constantly. I had to refrain from crying out when I fell onto a rock. Bruce helped me up and we continued out into the black. We finally felt safe enough to bring out our flashlights when we no longer heard the 2 men yelling. The light made everything black and white. We couldn't distinguish color at all. Bruce stopped me as I was preparing to move down from one tree to another. He pointed his flashlight toward where I was going, and I looked. An aberration hovered near the tree. I would have jumped right into it if Bruce hadn't seen the light bending around it. The map of dots was essentially useless this far from the clearing. There was no way to measure distance. Still, Bruce insisted on looking at it every once in a while to look for changes. His own journal didn't have this section in it, so he had to use mine. Before any of us moved, we looked carefully for any more aberrations. It was the only way to avoid catastrophe. Suddenly, we heard the yelling start up again, too close for comfort. Both of us snapped off our flashlights and stopped. We could hear their footfalls. They weren't trying to sneak around. "Marlene!" I could finally make out what they were saying. They were calling Grandma's name. The footsteps were right on top of us, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I leaned hard into the tree, trying to be as small as possible. "You 2 okay?" one of the men said from above. We both looked up the hill in horror. The 2 of them held onto the trees to keep from falling, but they laid eyes on us cautiously. We'd been seen. "Run!" I shouted, and sprinted around to flee. My foot caught on a root, and I fell face first down the hill. The steep decline fell beneath me, never giving me a handhold or a way to get my legs under me. I covered my head with my arms, letting go of the flashlight and the journal. The rolling came to an abrupt end when I slammed into a thick tree. My body spun away further, then came to rest in the pile of dead leaves. Coughing, I got to my feet. My eyes were seeing stars as the world flashed from bright to dark again on repeat. It was like standing in a room lit by a disco ball and a power drill. The world wouldn't stop spinning. Shaking my head, I stood up and almost fell over again. The hill was still relatively steep, and the leaves wouldn't make a very good foothold. Instinctively, I looked behind me when I stumbled backwards, and immediately dropped back to the ground, holding on for dear life. The sun and the moon spun in circles overhead, going from one horizon to the next in a span of milliseconds. The effect made me feel like I was going to fly off the earth as it spun. Looking up, I saw the light of the sun and the moon bend around the aberration right in front of me. It was only a foot or two away, the closest I'd ever been. Startled, I swam backwards through the leaves, scrambling uphill on my belly until the sun and moon's motion slowed down. When the movement was manageable, I got to my hands and knees and pulled myself up the hill. The moon slowed to a crawl, then didn't move at all as I got further from the aberration. Once I felt I was safely far away, I laid down and stared up the hill. I saw 2 trees where we had been leaning when I fell. Despite my dizziness telling me I'd fallen for miles, I'd only gone a few hundred feet. Bruce was gone. So were the 2 men. They were nowhere in sight. All 3 of them were gone. I looked up at the moon, high in the sky. No stars. I recalled the moon and the sun spinning wildly out of control. Reality hit me hard. I'd fallen too far, right next to an aberration. I'd gone forward in time. It took me a long time to get my emotions under control. The more I looked around, the more obvious it was. A tree with a knot the size of my head that I'd used for support just moments before was now a log on the ground, rotting. When I got my bearings, I stumbled around looking for my flashlight and journal. I found them halfway to the aberration, lying under piles of decaying leaves. The flashlight wouldn't turn on. The handle was rusted and damaged. The journal looked almost the same, on the other hand. Cracked leather, wet pages from being under leaves for so long, and faded handwriting. While inspecting my 2 lifelines, I glanced up and noticed the moon moving quickly again. I was still too close to the aberration that time was gliding by at a steady pace, albeit slower than when I had landed. I raced back up the hill to the 2 trees where I was safe. Unsure of what to do, I opened the journal, praying for another bullet point. Just one. Anything. Or another message from Grandpa. The page with the dots was blank. Completely empty. No. I flipped backward. The school page was missing content. X's lined the parallel lines, and that's when I realized. I'd been carrying Bruce's journal. He was using mine to check for added text. I'd offered to carry his. This journal was missing what I needed. Movement on a slight breeze caught my attention. The sun was starting to peek over the far horizon, giving me some light to see by. Another breeze moved something on a tree up the hill. A paper. I bolted upright and clambered toward it, never letting it leave my sight. At the tree, I found a stained, laminated sleeve stapled to the trunk, holding a paper. Below it was a second laminated sleeve, with a faded piece of paper inside. Below that, wrapped around the tree and clasped in the back, was a worn-out, threadbare utility belt. It held down the laminated paper so the wind wouldn't move it while I read. On it was swirling, slightly legible cursive. I'm about to leave this world. You saved my life. You got me out of here. Right after you disappeared, the map finished itself. The dots became my map. I never got to thank you. I've lived a long life now. I got married. I had kids. Your cousins love you even if they don't know you like I do. It took me decades to find this place again. This is the tree where the map appeared. I thought it appropriate to leave it here for you whenever you resurface again. I love you, little nephew. I'm sorry we didn't get to spend any more time together. I hope that I can help you escape like you helped me. Sincerely, your Uncle Bruce. P.S. You will need these, with an arrow pointing down. I fell against the tree on my knees. The plastic sleeves were both punctured in places and stained with mud, rain, and salt. The utility belt was weathered by time and storms as well. The duct tape was cracked and now a light gray. The string, which used to be a bright orange, was almost white. How long? How many decades had passed since these had been placed? I pictured an aging Uncle Bruce kneeling in front of the tree like I was now. wrapping the utility belt around the tree and stapling his letter to me against the tree. Tears began to flow, and when I looked down, I saw a rounded, flat stone. The name Mark was chiseled into it in all caps. A headstone. The sobs grew harder, and I hugged that tree for a long time. Finally, unable to cry anymore, I lifted myself up and pulled down the sleeves. The full sheet letter fell out. Weather hadn't been kind to it, but it was intact. The second paper, however, was aged far beyond the actual letter. When I picked it up, the page cracked in half. It was practically dust already. Carefully, I turned it over. It was a paper torn from my old journal. Large chunks were missing, and the handwriting, which had been fading before, was almost non-existent. The only truly legible part of the map showed a line between two dots, with a number between them. 25 feet, 15 inches. Measurements. Measured distances between each dot. Below the dots were 4 bullet points. I started to cry again because from the second one down it was my own handwriting. Even I used abbreviations. Don't be seen. Measure the aberrations. Don't go through. Choose the right one. I recognized the last bullet. It was from the school. Choose the right locker. Choose the right aberration. The unreadable map showed no indication of which one was the right one, and I couldn't copy an illegible map onto the journal I carried. I wanted to sit down and give up, toss myself into an aberration until it killed me. Why even try? Again, I saw an aging Uncle Bruce sitting in front of the tree, carefully placing my headstone down where he last saw me. For Bruce. Not for me, but for my uncle. To let him live longer than he got to in my time. I reached around the tree, unfastened the utility belt, and pulled it off. Standing up, I clicked the lock into place behind me. The contents jostled around and finally settled. I looked down at my tools. It was all the same tools that Bruce had on him before. A slot for the journal, a line of pencils, all intact, a rusty measuring tape, a line of sun-dried string, and a roll of cracked duct tape. The only thing missing was his flashlight. It would still be enough. All I had to do was map these aberrations, and it would point me to the way out, and let Bruce escape. Deep breaths, and then I started. It must have taken me thousands of years, and the reason it took me so long was because of the qualities around aberrations. I was able to find them only during the daytime, when the sun made their bent light obvious. First, I tried using a rock tied to a string, throwing it to get close to where the aberration actually was and measure. The rock vanished almost immediately within the 25-foot radius. It shot forward in time, never to be seen again. The string cut in half where the radius began, a waste of a precious resource. So, I had no other choice. If anything I threw in there would shoot forward in time, then I would have to go in with it. I had to wrap a line of string around a nearby tree, and tie one end to the measuring tape. I kept everything else on me and walked into the radius. The sun and moon slowly accelerated until they were spinning so fast that I puked. I took another step forward and the puke evaporated immediately. The light was enough to show me where the center of the aberration was. It hovered in the air, so to get an accurate measurement, I crawled along the ground and set the end of the tape measure under the middle of the shadow. Once I had my measurement, I would go back and find my equipment had aged severely on the outside, but luckily hadn't broken. 27. There were 27 aberrations I had to measure, and when it was all done, when the map was completed, I had an image. A squiggling arrow that pointed directly at the marked entrance. Back up the stairs. Except I'd been back there many times before. It was empty, nothing was there, nothing ever was. Still, I trudged back up the entire hill, taking a whole day to make it up. I hadn't heard a sound in all my time there. The men must have died with the passing of time. I felt no fear around making noise. My only fear was falling into an aberration. At the clearing, relief flooded over me. There it was. The stairs were back. I practically ran through the clearing, cheering and crying and laughing. At the first step I lifted my foot, but paused. Was this the right one? I'd chanted those bullet points over and over, all the time. I knew them. I had copied them into the new journal, first and foremost. Still, I opened the journal and stepped aside. The writing had faded already. With a pencil, I stenciled them back in while I thought. Choose the right one. Choose the right one. I looked to the side of the stairs. A point in the air was rippling like shadows a campfire makes. Time and space were rippling just a few feet away from the stairs. It was close enough that it should have been affecting time for me, but it wasn't. The right one. The stairs would be an obvious choice to take, but this aberration was to the right of where the arrow was pointing. This hadn't been here before, I was sure of it. I trusted myself. I trusted my reasoning. Why else would I copy the instructions exactly the same as in the school? The bullet points said not to go through the aberrations. But I decided to trust myself. Holding my utility belt tightly, journal tucked into its place, I walked into the aberration. I could barely keep my head straight. The whole clearing turned to dust, and that dust floated around me like an ocean. My body soared up and down through swells and dips. I was traveling extremely fast, and the dust was forming scenery. An ocean, a forest, buildings, houses. They formed around me, then were torn down again. I was flying through both time and space, not sure of my destination. I became entranced with what happened around me. I found myself around people and places I recognized. It was like flying through my life. Dust and particles recreated scenes from my life, and I lived them all over again, but as a fly on the wall, from a third-person perspective. Every grounding, every fight, every fun day at the beach, every terrible day at school, they all built themselves, then tore down. They seemed to be out of order, yet I still knew when each one was in relation to the others. Then came the parts I couldn't grasp. I saw myself hanging from a tree branch over a field of wolves with multiple eyes. Me being crushed under a couch and committing suicide in a way I had envisioned in Grandpa's basement. Me drowning in that basement, unable to open a wrong door. Over and over I died, hundreds of times, maybe thousands, all in the maze. A few times I made it far in the maze. At other times I got stuck and couldn't make it. I saw myself wander down the wrong stairs so many times in Grandpa's basement, trapped until I starved. The starvation would take decades to finally kill me because of the time aberrations. Watching myself get trapped in the double locker over and over again until the humanoids pulled me out, ripping me in half with their mirrored motions. I reached out after several times, willing myself to get out, wondering why I didn't do what I had already done. And when I reached out, urging myself to push, the words appeared in the journal, and I knew it wasn't Grandpa, it was me. I urged myself not to give up on those stairs. I shoved the journal down the stairs to make it open to my message. I knocked the stack of boxes over with Grandpa's old flashlight on top. I told myself to push. Here. Now. After watching myself die so many times, I was confused when the scenes changed into more of the maze, but not with me. I watched Bruce get dragged down the stairs his first time down. The body Bruce found, that was his first attempt. Another attempt was what found his own body. He'd been more prepared before, but something had kept him from being attacked the second time. I saw the creature lurking in the darkness of the main room, huddled in the corner below the stairs, listening for movements above. Its limbs all blended in the dark, but the sharp nails were discernible. That's what grabbed Jake. It's what killed Bruce the first time. Bruce did all of my same mistakes, except he was writing them all in the fresh, empty pages of the journal. He was the one, a young Bruce, scribbling in the dark, sobbing. It was us, I realized, watching the humanoids stuff both of our bodies into lockers over and over again. We starved over the decades, eventually coming out as those things, but not before becoming the cacophony of bangs in the hallways. I saw Jake. He was venturing down the stairs, but I wasn't with him. He was calling out my name, looking for me. Screaming, I told him to go back, to leave, but it was too late, and Jake ventured down all alone. Grandpa appeared, but instead of braving each room with no journal, no help, and no guide, I saw him carving runes into his walls. The finished basement walls were covered in them. Drywall dust littered the entire basement as he carved each one out. His hair stuck out at all ends. He looked insane. He looked desperate. The rooms split before my eyes into thousands before hiding themselves before each door. Grandpa scribbled notes into the beginning of the journal and went back to the stairs. He could leave freely. He did this. Grandpa made this. I felt for my journal, wanting to read, wanting to see what was in the beginning of the book, the part I had skipped over in favor of Bruce's maps. But I was ethereal. I could only watch the dust build these scenes. He went to his old high school. I knew it was his because I saw the name and I recognized it. He carved runes above the lockers in the hallway late at night. He'd broken in. I'd watched him carve runes in dozens of places. A campsite with my dad and Bruce as kids. The wall of a cave somewhere. The side of a freeway. A beach. And Grandpa's age varied with each one. How? Had he really been doing this since before he was even married? I saw a young version of Grandpa dive in front of the car. His body flew down the embankment past Bruce's car. The body was mangled beyond recognition. Finally, the dust, which I realized now was sand, began to settle and calm. I was almost to my destination. The end of it all. My body dropped several feet, bracing for impact as I slid down a small sand dune. I held my breath as the sand twirled around me. When I finally rolled to a stop, I coughed. Sand was everywhere. My eyes were burning, and as I rubbed them, I realized they were caked in sand. I was finally able to see and looked around. I was on a beach. An ocean rested still just a few yards away. Everything else was sand. Behind me, the sand reached far into the sky like a mountain. I couldn't see where it ended. I saw a layer of sand that had broken off where my body had emerged through and dropped here. I stood up, and the ocean glimmered like a rainbow. The grease. The sky above was a dark purple, something much darker than the type of purple that's at sunset. It tinged the entire landscape with a lighter shade of pink. Mid-cough, I choked. Just a few feet away lay Jake, face down in the sand. "Jake! Jake!" I screamed, voice hoarse. I ran forward and fell beside him. My heart stopped as I saw the blood coating the sand around him. "Jake!" I cried, rolling him over. His entire front was sliced to pieces. An image of the creature under the stairs reappeared in my mind. It had done this. It had dragged him all the way here and killed him. "Hello, Mark," someone said calmly. How could they be calm? Jake was dead. I looked up. It was Grandpa. Not my grandpa, though. This man was in his early 40s. He stood up straight and looked down on me like I was nothing, like I didn't matter. Swallowing, I stood up. "He's dead," I accused. Grandpa nodded. No sympathy. "Bring him back," I demanded. Grandpa looked surprised. "Why?" I gaped at him. "He's your grandson. So am I. What the hell is wrong with you? Why would you do all of this?" "I don't have any grandchildren," he replied, still calm as that ocean. "Not yet, you don't," I snarled. "I never will, Mark. Do you have any idea what this is all for? What this place does?" "You went crazy. You lost it. I saw that much," I said, pointing to the sand mountain looming behind us. "That," he said, following my gaze, "is an hourglass. A timekeeper for our little part of the universe. I came here because I can change the speed it runs here. I can also see anything I want." In a rapid motion, he swiped up a fistful of sand and threw it into my eyes. It burned at first, and I screamed, lowering my head and covering my eyes. The burning gave way to another scene. This man, this younger grandpa, going into the ocean and coming out of his own basement. Him bringing boxes of Marlene's things to older versions of himself, each one broken, each one depressed. He brought a version of Marlene through, making sure they had everything they needed to continue their life. The reunions were full of cries and joy. He comforted them and left the way he'd come. He'd brought boxes to my own grandpa's house. but he had been unreachable. I wiped the sand away and backed away to get the rest out away from his reach. "You built this to cheer yourself up?" I sneered. "I built this to cultivate my family. I missed my family, Mark. Marlene and Bruce, they're all I ever truly had." As if on cue, I saw a woman and her son building a sandcastle off towards the water. Grandma and a young Uncle Bruce. I only had one chance to be with them before. I had to go through so much more than you, Mark. It was dangerous, deadly. I created that maze intentionally. It was designed intentionally. The stairs generate a unique field where every decision splits the timeline. I had to get here, but I needed more chances to avoid failure. I thought back to the basement. 5 doors, 30 stages. That alone had 5 to the 30 decisions. And all those lockers, so many choices. Grandpa had essentially infinite lives, infinite attempts to cross the maze and get here. "What about James?" I asked, looking back. "James?" "My dad," I spat. He looked at me, puzzled. "You did this too early. You haven't even had my dad yet, your second kid." "I wanted it this early, before any catastrophe struck. When I come from, we found Marlene's cancer at 38. Now she's cancer-free and living forever at 35. Bruce is still a child and can play forever." I narrowed my eyes at him. "I was a wreck after she died," he said, staring into space. "And when Bruce got older, he left me too. I was lonely." He looked back at me. "Maybe one day you would have understood. I just want to have my family, Mark." Grandpa took a threatening step in my direction. "And you just killed my grown-up Bruce." "I didn't kill him," I snapped. "He's dead to me," Grandpa shouted back, the sand around us rippling. A large section came loose from the sand mountain and created an avalanche far away. It created a distant boom that made the ocean ripple as well. "You let him out of my pathway for him. I was leading him to our home. I would have been with him. Instead, you sent him here, and now he's gone," he shouted, pointing towards the ocean. "I wanted the Bruce I never got to have because he grew to hate me." "That's childish and irresponsible," I accused. "Everyone dies, even you. You left the basement cursed. I went into your house after you died. That's how I got here. That's how I ruined your precious reunion. And that's how Jake..." I stopped myself before I could cry again. Grandpa breathed and surveyed the beach. "It's time for you to leave," he said harshly. I looked up at him even as he whistled. A black shape came charging out of the sand mountain, bursting waves of sand in every direction as it ran towards us on all 4 limbs. Grandpa backed away as I turned to see what was coming. It was the creature, the one with nails on every limb, the one that killed Jake. It was Grandpa. It was always Grandpa. I started to jump to my feet, but not before grabbing 2 fistfuls of sand. As I rose, I threw one fist right into Grandpa's eyes. He doubled over but didn't scream. Let him hallucinate about the life he left behind for a bit. With one hand still full, I ran full speed toward the ocean. Grandpa had accidentally showed me how to leave. Through the ocean. I just had to get there. The creature wasn't far behind me. Its shape writhed and twisted under the light, never holding the same form. It wasn't made out of matter. Yet another aberration. The beach itself was an aberration. The rainbow-colored ocean was pulling away from me, receding in waves as I ran toward it. I was gaining on it, but it was further than I anticipated. It was evaporating away as I ran through both time and space. The sand under my feet changed constantly from a brittle surface to deep sand, to being dotted with window-sized panes of glass. One day, this whole beach would be one long, flat piece of glass. Where would his future be then? That future came suddenly. One second I was trudging through sand, and the next I was walking on glass dotted with sand, like snow on a piece of ice. I slipped, but managed to roll away before the creature smashed into the surface where I'd fallen. The glass cracked, and I scrambled away to avoid being caught in the broken glass. It sunk down into the sand below. Its scrambling movements dug it deeper and deeper. It tried to grab the glass to pull itself out, but the edges broke off each time. Backing up, I got a better look at it. Just like everything else, it was Grandpa. The first one. The one that came first and died. Its body had decomposed and joined with the aberration around the stairs, making him a mixture of matter and not. I swallowed, backing away even further. High in the distance, looming over the entire beach, I finally saw it. The hourglass. The top half was almost empty, and the bottom, forming a mountain-sized teardrop shape, was almost full. But as I stepped back further, it changed in an instant to have more sand on top, dripping down to the bottom so slowly that it was imperceptible. The creature in front of me was gone, replaced with a field of sand where the glass had been. My feet sunk back down, reminding me that I'd gone back in time again. Not wanting to wait around for it to get out, I took off running down the beach, heading for the water. Finally, I reached it. The beach had morphed once again into a glassy shelf. I slipped and slid my way to the edge, finally coming to an end. The water was several feet below me, and my shoes clung to a sharp edge of glass. This was it. On a whim, I pulled out the journal and flipped to the very end. The last page had a diagram of a system of caves, a part of the maze I'd never made it to. After that was a blank page. In the beginning, at Grandpa's house, I'd flipped through the book from the beginning to the end. Now was my chance. Now I had a chance to prevent all of this. Grandpa had infinite lives because of the way he built the maze. But if that was true, then so did I. The journal had made it full circle from Bruce to me and back to Bruce. Maybe I would make it full circle too. On the very last page, I pulled a pencil from my utility belt and wrote 3 words. Send Jake home. My new objective. Not to get to the end of the maze, just to get Jake home. With that, I secured the journal to my belt, sucked in a deep breath, and jumped. I came to being fully awake. I was standing at the top of the stairs next to the door. There were flashes of memories from being in the ocean. The grease flowed like water, and I was drenched when I emerged on the other side. I had done something. Now I was here. When was here? I checked my body. Everything was intact, utility belt and all. My body was drenched in a rainbow reflective grease. I was dripping all over, and it was all over the door. I felt my pockets and found my phone. Excited, I sat up. Power on. The screen activated without a hitch. On cue, a text came through. It was my mom texting me their orders from Panda Express. I was here, back where I started, just slightly after time had skipped forward. Looking at the door to the basement, I saw that it was open. No noise was coming from down there. I was down there. Right now, I was down there. Infinite me's about to do it all over again. Pensively, I unbuckled the utility belt from around my waist. I removed the journal and tossed the utility belt downstairs. It hit the far door with a crack, then came to rest on the bottom step. I'd need that if I was going to do better this time. For now, I had to take home food for dinner. Jake would be there. Jake would be alive. I could save him. I could keep him away from here. Frowning, I opened the journal. I went straight to the back, making sure my message to myself was still there. It wasn't the one I had written. Another me had rewritten it. Send Jake down. I stared at it, wondering. But, like the aberration next to the stairs in the clearing, I decided to trust myself. I'd tell Jake to meet me here exactly as before. I had to trust myself. After all, I'd done this 1,000 times. Gently, I set the journal with my new message on the floor at the top of the stairs. I'd slip there, and it would all start again. Before leaving, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I found a number that hadn't been there before. I hit call. It rang 3 times. Hello? My throat choked up. Uncle Bruce? I whispered, trying not to cry. Holy shit, Bruce said. You made it out. This has been Grandpa Mapped Out His Entire Basement by Harrison Prince.